Hello, in this tutorial we're going to look at techniques to animate fingers efficiently. First, you want to make sure you have your rig correctly set up. There is an option that you want to disable because if you push the rig too far, at some point the bones stop following, even though you're trying to push your pose and push the controls beyond. This option is on your character, properties or character settings, and all the way down to fingers. You want to disable human finger limits. So that should be set correctly by your rigger or yourself if you create your own rigs. The other thing is the fingers. They are made of FK controls as well as IK tips, okay, IK controls. And I highly recommend having those. So for that you need to make sure you have the bones that deform your model, obviously, but also a bone at the tip, okay? Even if those don't influence any vertex, you may not export them in your game engine unless you need runtime IK solving in the game engine, but otherwise you don't need those, just in MotionBuilder. And when you define your character, they should be entered here in the definition. So when you have that, you can directly manipulate the fingers from the tip. And also I recommend using the custom UI that I show in a customization tutorial. This way, with this picker, you can directly grab the tips of the fingers from the main body viewport. And inside the hand viewport, you have access to the mid phalange here. The mid phalange, so I can quickly grab this phalange over here and rotate that, or I can move through the hierarchy with the up and down arrows on my keyboard. So with up, I'll select the parents, so I can rotate the base, or down to select the tips. Okay, and if you've made metacarpals, we have a pretty fancy rig here with metacarpals articulations. You can also select them here with that custom UI. So the FK controls are pretty standards. You can select them one by one and animate in body part or in selection mode if you want, and edit the keys of just your selection. Or you can select an entire long segment like this, and it selects the 3 phalanges of your finger. This way you can rotate and curl the fingers like this. So you could select all of them and curl all of them at once, right? And if you've opened the hand like this and you just want to articulate the base, you can also do it like that. Okay, same for the thumb, obviously. And if you select just the fingertips, you can animate by rotating the fingertips, and it also curls the entire segment. Okay, you can do it sideways as well. Or you can move the fingertips, so the IK effectors. You can move them like that, which is very intuitive. And you can pin the rotation or the translation of your fingers. So if I pin this and I work in full body and I rotate my hand, the fingers are pinned in translation. Same for the thumb. Okay, so that's pretty handy for contacts, for example. I can also pin the rotation, so they tend to keep the same overall orientation. Okay, and when I pin the translation, what I can do is, if I rotate it, it creates this behavior instead of this behavior. So it's very nice if you need to press the finger against something. Okay, you get kind of the same effect if you select the 3rd phalange and you do it like this. You can adjust that as well. Okay, so I'll remove all the pinning to get back to a normal FK setup. And yeah, so the phalange can't be the mid phalange can't be pushed further than this, because otherwise it would break the IK solver. but you can push the last phalange a little further if you want, and you can articulate the first phalange however you want. So that's it for the basic controls. And with those basic controls, my advice is to create a pose library. So when you start on a new character, you can, create a fist, create like a pointing finger pose, spread poses, any kind of like extreme. Okay. So this is an example of my pose library here. So I have like a relaxed pose, a more like neutral one. I have a fist, and the fist, for the fist it's really nice to have those metacarpals because you can really, tighten the fingers together and fine-tune the fist pose. I have all sorts of poses like that. Tense, open, wide, see really extreme poses sometimes. Flat, this one, crooked hand, have this one, and that one. And I kind of use those like people, in rigs, they often have the attributes like curl, spread, and I've kind of used those poses to do the same effect. So let's look at an example. We have this arm reaching for the pole, and the hand is like placing itself around the pole nicely. So we just want to animate the fingers around that. And then we have the arm letting go and kind of dropping. So instead of, manually hand keying the fingers throughout the entire timeline, what I would do with all those poses is create a layer, have, of course, a basic pose at the end, so maybe relaxed, and I can start adding some in between. So maybe I'll add like the tight, okay, and I have like this kind of gesture here. And what I can do is starting to dial a little bit my poses. So instead of using 100% of the tight pose here, I could just move it and then key to just keep a small amount of it, or maybe I only want the hand to tighten a little bit further down the road. Okay, and here up I could have another pose where the hand opens up super wide. Okay, so it's super extreme, but again I can dial it down and maybe go in the subview and dial it per finger. So I'm going to select my metacarpal and my segment here. So I select both the metacarpal and all the phalanges. I go to selection mode and I will dial just this one. Okay, and then I'll take the ring and dial that one a little bit less, and take the middle and just dial it one frame back. So I have like this more natural pose that comes in. I can also work on the thumb up, and then I go back to selection, to body part mode, and I key. And then I can delete all the keys that I moved in gray. Okay. And here maybe the finger should flatten up a bit earlier. If I have very precise contacts, then I might, hand edit my in between if I want. But basically I quickly block out the different key poses by using the pose library. Okay, and I can again pin the tip and just rotate it if I want to keep the same distance, but just change the I want to keep the same tip position, but I just want to change the profile of the finger a bit. And of course, when you work on fingers, that's sometimes when you realize when the arm needs some adjustments as well. So usually I work like back and forth on the two at the same time. I could select my wrist and then select a fingertip and use the shift around rotation, like rotate around option to do this as well. Have some nice pivots. Okay, and when the hand closes on the bar, I can probably use my fist, but of course it's way too close, so I'm gonna dial it back like this. Sometimes you'll get weird interpolations. That's when you have two keys next to each other, or like too close. So when that happens, you want to just make one of those keys linear or auto, because it's basically the F curves are kind of jumping like that. Okay, you have two keys next to each other, so the tangent is kind of exploded. Just select that and set it to auto here, or discontinue, which is linear. So my tangent is linear, and I have a less weird interpolation in between. So here my index is kind of okay, but not the pinky, so I'll use my decrescendo pose, or crescendo pose, and just dial it back like this slightly, up, and I would just fine-tune the contacts once I'm pretty much there, you know, the last 10% basically. And I just, you know, move my camera to be in just like kind of in screen space, and most of the time I just use the screen space transform, which is the little square in the middle here. Up, and I would like place the tip and then just pin the tip and then rotate a bit to adjust the whole feel of the finger. So if you pin and you rotate, you can also, you know, change just the rotation like that, which is super intuitive. Could also play around with the meta couple here, just open that up. Not too much, always be careful with meta couples. Up, decrescendo, but this is like too tight, so I'll also use some of my open pose. Just move it slightly to get what I want. Play on frames. And when the hand goes back down, I can easily like do that even more loosely. Like have a white here, I have a very like tight fist over there, and then get some kind of in between that I cut to paste, and that one. I have some kind of like have a little bounce here. It's quite subtle. Okay, so I have a little bounce here, but it's too strong. So what I'll do is just animate the weight of my finger. So I have a little, you know, overlap here, little bounce effect, but it's too strong, right? The poses are going too far, so I'm gonna play around with the weight of my layer, and I'm gonna animate that. Like, let's say I'm happy with that animation up until here, so I'll key around here, and then I'll just start animating down the layer. Okay, so it gives something a little more natural. And I can, of course, delay again the timing of the fingers separately. So maybe the pinky is after. Depending on the motion, sometimes I delay the pinky, then the ring, then the middle, or I do the other way around. I delay the index, then the middle, then the ring. So that's a little exaggerated, but it's to show you how you can quickly get motion without hand animating too much. Just having the poses to block out, and then playing around with the layers, playing around with the keys to get what you want. Actually, there's another way to create secondary motion on the fingers. I have some kind of loop here where the arm is pretty shaky. Okay, it was based on some motion capture actually. You can see that it loops. I'm gonna apply a pose on the fingers. I'm gonna bake that. And now I'm gonna play with the IK-Blend rotation of the fingers, and I'm gonna offset their curves in the F-Curves editor. So I grab all the fingertips, I make sure I have all my curves selected, right click, pre-post extrapolation. I'm gonna make the extrapolation to repetition mode, before and after, and infinite. So now my curves repeat themselves, and I kind of set them in time a little bit. Nothing happens yet, but if I turn on the IK-Blend rotation, you can see some overlap is happening. I might increase the effect by moving this a bit further. And I can also try it on the translation actually. If I play with the translation as well, it might increase the effect, but it might give some weird effects on the translation. And of course I could change the settings per fingers. Maybe the pinky will have a bit less, the ring a little bit more than the pinky, and the index has the maximum, for example. So this is interesting, a nice little effect. There's another way to I'm going to go to a second loop here. The other way is to extract the motion of the wrist and use that to control a layer. Okay, so there are two ways. You could just take directly the translation of the wrist, or you could measure its speed. So I'll show you how. Let's say I create a first layer here where I do animate my fingers just a little bit, just to kind of control a little bit the acting, right? So I'm gonna add my pose at the beginning and at the end, and I'm gonna just animate a little bit in between. Well, actually, before I do that, I should have this pose here baked to start off, because I don't want my base pose on the base layer to be flat like this. So if you come from mocap, pretty basic setup, you probably have flat fingers if they weren't recorded. So just apply a first pose, bake that, and then on that animation layer, I want those first keys to be 0 keys. Okay, I have 0 key, and that's my pose that I've baked. And now I can do what I was doing. Kind of based on the motion here, I kind of create some expression. Right, so if I look at the animation right now, it's pretty robotic. I could polish it more, but basically the idea is going to be to play with the weight of the layer and animate that automatically based on the movement of the hand. So I can grab my wrist here on the base layer, find some significant motion, for example maybe the like the movement on the z-axis, so the forward motion is interesting. So of course I select the IK effector, not the wrist, because the wrist itself has a constant translation, the FK. So I select the effector, and I copy, for example, this curve. I go to my animation layer, and on my animation layer here, I see the weight. I can create a first key, so it becomes animatable. And I'm gonna paste the curve that I copied from the wrist translation. Of course, this curve probably has like irrelevant values, right? From -2 to 17, knowing a layer weight is from 0 to 100. So I can shift that a bit. I can do the same trick we've seen before, making the pre-post extrapolation infinite. So now I can delay a bit the layer. Now let's look at the result. There's a lot more like subtle noise that happens basically. Like my whole animation is kind of dialed down, and I can of course edit it a bit more if there are some moments where my poses were a bit strange. I can, like for example here, this is the maximum. I could take that, put some fall off radius here, and just bring down this curve. Maybe bring this one up. And if there are moments that I want to push, I can select a few keys here and there, and just bring them up. So selecting the wrist and grabbing its translation and copying that is one way. There's another way, which is measuring the acceleration of the wrist. For this, we'll create a relation constraint. Okay. I want to get the position of my wrist. I'll make that a little larger. Okay, so I grab my wrist in the viewport, hold X, click and drag, sender. Now I'm going to go in vector and find speed. So I want to get the speed of the translation. Okay. And I can get the scale. No, not the scale. I want the length of that vector. Alright. And what I want to do is create a locator to bake that information, basically. So I'll say right click here, insert, or asset browser, elements, null. Okay, I put a null here, just gonna make that a bit bigger. Alright, I'm gonna bring that guy here, receiver. So I want this guy to be driven by my little calculation here, and I'm gonna drive its translation. So because this is a number, right, we've converted a vector to a number because we take the length of a vector, so that gives us just a simple float. When I input this back into the translation of the null, so a number into a vector, I have this converter that reappears. In my case, just for visibility, I want to drive the Z. I prefer, so I'm gonna just disconnect the X, and of course now I'm overriding the translation of the null on X, Y, and Z, even though I only have an input in Z, but X and Y receive a value too, so it's 0, 0. So just for visibility, I'll input a value on X manually, so I'll do right click, set value, and I'll put a value of 50, for instance. So it's 50 centimeters to the left of the character, and it's just easier to visualize. But the most important is to have, just the length being put in one of the axes. This way you can visualize what's going on here, right? So you can see with the frame rate, it's like super fast, right? So it's a little jittery, but you can see it's a little bit like a sound wave, you know, when you have sound and based on the intensity of the sound, you see this this graphic that goes up and down. It's the same thing, but based on the motion of the wrist, basically. So I'm gonna get that and just bake all its properties. So now I can disable the relation, deactivate it, and I still have the motion, right? And now it's just, it jitters a little bit less because it's like just happening at 30 FPS if you have play on frames here. And if I look at the curves here on the z-axis, I can see this. So it's not exactly the same profile that we had before, right? If I select my anim layer and I look at its weight, you know, it's the new curve that we have is a lot noisier because we took into account the acceleration on all axes, on x, y, z. We didn't just take one axis arbitrarily. So it might be just more interesting input for your finger animation. Okay, so let's make it, as always, infinite. Okay, I can see that on the first frame, usually there's like a value of 0, because on the first frame wasn't able to get a speed, because there's nothing passed in time to get that. So usually you want to just copy the last frame, the last key on the first one, and you should get a nice profile. And then just offset that a few frames. Okay, and at that point I can copy this and put it in my anim layer as the weight. Okay, and again I can push the maximum if I want to 100. You can see that there's a lot more noise happening now. And it might be too much, right? It might be just a little too much noise. So of course you can edit that curve with some filters. Up around here, filter, Butterworth, maybe a value of 4. The lower the value, the more powerful the Butterworth. Up, smooth it out. I mean, I could also do a peak removal if I wanted to. Remove the extremes. Maybe I'll do another pass of this and just push it again. So it gives just a smoother, slightly less noisier result. And that might be just too much stuff happening at that point, but that's also because I have a lot of poses on my layer, right? By the way, if you see a lot of keys like that, it's because your animation layer weight is still selected. So it shows you every key that you have here, right? So I want to deselect that. Now I only see the keys that I made myself. And honestly, if that's too much, you could also just get away with one key, right? It's just one little key that has the hand like folding like this, right? But I recommend doing this when you have a long take of mocaps. You can bake the animation of the acceleration of the wrist on the locator on multiple takes, and then quickly stab in some noise on the fingers, especially for like more background animations that don't matter too much. It's a quick way to just make the fingers kind of alive, and just get something in there, right? The last part is about finger contacts. So I have an animation here where the arm comes down and just touches the floor. I'm going to stab in some poses here, as always. Making sure the fingers don't pass through the floor. So I'm bringing the fingers into position here. And let's say at some point I have like this key moment where the hand is kind of stable. So here I'm going to spend a little bit more time polishing my contacts. Just once. So I'm pretty happy with this pose here. The fingers slightly go through, that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to remember that frame, 36 is where I have my key pose, let's say. And then of course for the rest of the the rest of the timeline, the hand has a little bit of motion, right? It's not completely still. So my fingers, like, because they're all FK, they don't keep contact with the floor long enough, right? But that's what we're going to fix. So I'm going to key a little one more time, like around here, 66, well, that's easy to remember, 36, 66. And up around here, I'm just going to reanimate a little bit the transition, right? So as my fingers leave the floor, I'll just like have them bend slightly. Again, macro edits at that point. Just creating that performance, if I can call it that way. So when the fingers lift, maybe I'll just curl them a little. Okay, so I have my block out here, and I just want to clean up the contacts when the hand touches the floor. So I'm going to bake everything. I'm going to probably duplicate my base layer, so I can keep a safe version underneath. And basically, I can do it manually. I can select my effectors here and basically delete the keys that I have before, a little bit before 36, which is my key pose, and a little bit after 66. I'm lazy, so I'm just going to use the Python tool Stay on Floor from Neo 3D, because that's a wonderful tool. So on frame 36, I'll say start. On frame 66, I'll say stop. Maybe I want a 5 frames blend here, and I'll put the cursor on 36 so it applies this pose. On 66, so it deletes the 5 keys before and after, and then on 36 and 66 I have exactly the same keys. You don't see the result yet because I'm still in FK mode, but if I input some IK blending, a little bit of translation, a tiny bit of rotation, you can see now I have this. Right, so now that I have like IK blend, if I were to move my wrist more, my fingers just stay there, right? Of course, you have like extreme poses that are almost like stretch fingers, then you'll see this kind of IK pops happening. So it kind of depends on your animation, of course. Like maybe here I'm just a little too flat, so too stretchy, so I can, you know, adjust the hand too if I need. At least I have perfect contacts here, right? And at some point I can always, you know, bake everything again, remove the IK blend translation, select all my phalanges, and just on the base layer, like, use some Butterworth, especially during the transition moments, to just smooth out those IK pops a bit. That's pretty smooth. And one last tip is when you have IK blend on, if you feel like you've broken the fingers a little too much, you know, rotate it on the y-axis and you've kind of broken this, for example. You can always select the FK and just clean up the rotation. So if you take these and you just input a value of 0, your finger will be, readjusted, and you won't have like broken phalanges basically. So that's something you can do when you pose as well, using the pinning. So not the IK blend, but the pinning. If I break the phalanges like so, okay, I can always like select all my branches, all my phalanges segments, and here in the viewport on local rotation I'll do 0, 0, 0. Now it kind of unbreaks the fingers. Of course it kind of changed a little bit the profile, but if you want to make sure you didn't go too far and break the model, it's a good way to solve things.